Hey there, Sooners Nation, and welcome to the Monday edition of the Locked On Sooners podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Coming up on today's show, we'll talk about what went wrong for the Oklahoma Sooners on both sides of the football and where do they go from here. All that and more on today's episode of Locked On Sooners.
You are Locked On Sooners, your daily podcast on the Oklahoma Sooners, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Sooners Nation, and welcome to a very disappointing Monday edition of the Locked On Sooners podcast. Not that the show will be disappointing, but we're still disappointed from the Oklahoma Sooners 27-14 loss to the Baylor Bears. Oklahoma went on the road to Waco and came up empty, now falling to 9-1 on the season. And it was a gut check performance for the Sooners, who had yet to have what most people would consider a quality opponent on the schedule in the win column. And they were unable to really do much of anything against a Bears team that brought one of their best games of the season and brought a physical level of play that Oklahoma just wasn't ready for. And I think that is the story of this game. Offensively, Oklahoma really couldn't do much. And it was evident that from the opening whistle that the Baylor Bears were the more physical team and were ready to play this game, the more intense team as well. And you saw it not just with Baylor's pass rush, the way that they played the run, but I feel like you also saw it in the second level of the defense as well, the third level of the defense, the way that they were contesting and defending Oklahoma's wide receivers. It was really tough. The wide receivers just weren't getting any clean breaks, not any clean separation. And I think that's what led to a lot of Caleb Williams sacks. I mean, there were times in the first half of the game where he did have time to stand in the pocket and scan the defense, but Oklahoma wide receivers just weren't getting open very well. From what it appeared on the broadcast view, obviously the all 22 tape might show a different story, but it was evident that Caleb Williams didn't really feel comfortable with where he wanted to throw the football. And some of the contested throws he made, Oklahoma receivers just weren't able to come up with the ball. He had the two interceptions. One of them was in a 50-50 ball that he just didn't put out there enough for his wide receiver, and it got undercut by a Baylor defender. There were several times, on just simple 10-yard curl routes where, the Oklahoma receiver just didn't get any kind of separation, and the Baylor Bear defender was able to come in and make the play and separate Oklahoma from the ball. And I think that was just kind of a microcosm of what was going on that day, because the Oklahoma Sooners defense, and we'll talk about that more in depth here coming up, they played a pretty good game, but Oklahoma's offense just couldn't get anything going consistently enough to mount much of an offensive effort. And I was not surprised that it was going to be a close game through the first half. Baylor's played Oklahoma really, really tough over the last two games, especially in the regular season. In both 2019 and 2020, in the regular season matchup, they held the Sooners to 10 points in both of those first half games. Back in 2019, Baylor jumped out to a big lead. It was 31-10 at halftime, I think, and Oklahoma mounted an incredible comeback and outscored the Bears 24-0 in the second half. And then last year again, Baylor holds Oklahoma to 10 points, but they're leading 10-0 at the break, and it's not as big of a deal. Oklahoma comes out and scored 17 points in the second half and is able to control the game for the most part, because Baylor's offense just last year wasn't very good. We talked about it on the show leading in. Baylor had only averaged 90 yards per game rushing in 2020 heading into the Oklahoma Sooners game. This year they were averaging 230 rushing yards per game heading into this matchup. And for Oklahoma, they needed to have a good game offensively and control the football offensively for that, just to be able to help their defense and not make their defense have to sit on the field as much as we've seen them have to in previous games, where against the Kansas game or in the Kansas State game where, they were playing ball control offense and keeping the Oklahoma Sooners defense on the field, just constantly wearing them down. The difference in those games is that, obviously in the Kansas game, they didn't score in the first half, but they came back in the second half and were able to put drives together and score points. In the Kansas State game, they scored every single drive except for the final one where they kneeled down. Well, in this one, they were having a lot more difficult time scoring points. And obviously that's because Baylor Bears defense is really good. They're a much better defense. But a lot of it was just Oklahoma's offense was just out of sync and they couldn't figure out what to do against the Baylor Bears. And some of that might just be the fact that Dave Aranda and the Bears defensive staff just has a really good feel for what Lincoln Riley wants to do offensively, which is a bit of a problem. And they know what to expect. And at this point, it's hard to kind of discount that idea because they've increasingly played Oklahoma better each of the last couple of years. And now it culminated in a Baylor Bears win where they come up with a big upset 27-14. And, you look at what Oklahoma was able to do, they were only 2 of 9 on third down. You're not going to win many football games if you can't convert on third down. Now, if you just avoid third down altogether, then that's even better. But if you're going to have 9 third down opportunities and only convert 2 of them, that's not going to win you football games. You're not going to be able to be there at the end of the game and have a chance to win because you got to stay on the field. And that's a big reason why the Baylor Bears were able to run for so many yards and the defense kind of let up in the fourth quarter and the dam kind of broke in the fourth quarter. It's because they were wore out. Baylor just had the ball longer. Caleb Williams had his worst performance of the season, just did not look comfortable. Just as we're starting to try and like get him, hyped up for Heisman contender, he lays an egg, man. He just did not have a good game. Only completed 10 of 19 for 144 yards, had the 2 interceptions. On that second one, I think the Baylor defender made just a great play along the sideline and, to pick off Caleb Williams, who looked to be maybe throwing it out of bounds. It's hard to know exactly, but just not a good game. Just didn't look comfortable. His legs really didn't look underneath him when he was running the football. He just kind of looked wobbly. Didn't look like he just really physically had it in him. And maybe there's something about these 11 a.m. road games that just have the Sooners just messed up because we saw it in the Kansas game. It took them a half to get going. Now in this one, Baylor's physicality just never let the Sooners get comfortable. And that's something that they're going to have to look at and correct is like, how do we as an offense combat a physical defense? Because they're going to play a couple more coming up. And then when they get ready to transition into the SEC, they're going to have to figure out a level of physicality that allows them to compete and contend in the SEC too, because this team did not look good enough to contend for the Big 12. Obviously, they didn't look good enough to compete for a college football playoff national championship. And when they move to the SEC, it's going to look rough. And I'm going to allow for them to have a down game. The problem is having a down game, especially on the offensive side of the football this late in the season, doesn't give you a lot of room to work with if you're hoping to make it into the college football playoff. The college football playoff committee already doesn't like you. They ranked you 8th in each of the first 2 initial rankings, basically saying you haven't done enough. You haven't proven anything to us. And so this is where you're going to sit until you prove something to us. Well, Oklahoma fell flat on their face with an opportunity to prove to the college football playoff committee that they belong in the top 4. They stunk it up and didn't play a good game at all. It was one of their worst games of the season. It was the first time in the Lincoln Riley era that they had been beaten by a Big 12 team by more than a touchdown or a field goal. And I think that's where some of Lincoln Riley's frustration has been. I mean, they've always either they've won every Big 12 game, or the games that they've lost, they lost within a score. It was a really close game, whether it was a Texas game or K-State, Iowa State last year, they've been in those games, but this was a totally different story for the Oklahoma Sooners. And, you hope that they can bounce back against Iowa State, but that's going to be a tough matchup as well, because this Iowa State team will be coming off of a disappointing loss themselves to Texas Tech. And they have a good defense and they have a great running game with Breece Hall. And if the Oklahoma Sooners aren't able to figure out a way to play better offensively, and like we talked about last week, Texas Tech had a good game against Iowa State's offense or defense. West Virginia did a few weeks ago as well. Oklahoma should be able to do something against Iowa State offensively, but I thought they were going to be able to do something against Baylor offensively too, and they just completely laid an egg. So hard to know exactly what we're going to get out of Oklahoma against Iowa State, but we'll talk more about that as the week goes on. But let's talk about what happened on the defensive side of the ball, because I felt like they had a pretty good game. We'll talk about that coming up next. But first, I want to talk to you about Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. Have you heard about Prize Picks? I love this, and I know you will too. It's a leader in college sports daily fantasy. They offer more college football props than anyone in the world and offers all the star players of the Power Five as well as mid-major players that you might not have ever even heard of. PrizePicks offers any prop you can think of, from yardage to touchdowns, even interceptions thrown. And if you use our promo code Locked On, you can get a 100% instant deposit match of up to $100. Just make sure you use our promo code Locked On. PrizePicks allows mixed sport entries. You can take the over on Caleb Williams passing yards. You can take the under on, interceptions thrown. You can do it on the App Store or Google Play Store. You can go to their website, prizepicks.com. Remember, use our promo code Locked On to get your 100% deposit match over at prizepicks.com. That's PrizePicks, daily fantasy made easy. All right, let's talk about the defense here. It was a really good game from the defense. I mean, they were giving up a lot of yardage in the first half to Baylor, and Baylor was, driving the football fairly well, especially on the ground. They were having a decent game, but Oklahoma was still able to hold up. They held up the Bears in the red zone. The Bears had a 4th and 2, and Gary Bohannon misses a guy that could have led to a touchdown. But Oklahoma, despite giving up the yards, despite kind of giving up some first downs, they were staying there. They were playing this bend don't break defense for much of the game, and through 3 quarters they'd only allowed 10 points while their offense wasn't really doing much of anything. Now the well kind of broke open in the 4th quarter, and Baylor had added 17 points to the board and just kind of ran away with the thing. But it was a good performance, I feel like, from the defense, and that's an encouraging sign. That they can play this well, and they can at least like slow a team down, even if they're marching down the field. They can end up making a stop when they need to make a stop, because again, they're going to play an Iowa State team coming up that does run the ball really, really well. So does Oklahoma State. Both play some physical brands of football, and the Oklahoma defense was pretty well ready for it. They played it. Like I said, they played a solid game, but ultimately they just got wore out, I think, is what happened. They did allow 296 yards rushing to Baylor, which isn't good. And at the same time, you're watching this game play, and they're getting turnovers. They're getting after Gary Bohannon, making him, forcing him into mistakes. They're forcing some drops. They're forcing some incomplete passes. You don't necessarily hate what the defense is doing, but then at the end of the game, you're like, well, that's kind of a letdown of a performance. You would have liked to see them play a little bit better throughout. I feel like overall it was solid. You have a guy like Brian Asamoah, who I felt like played a really, really good game. He had 5 stops according to Pro Football Focus, 7 solo tackles, 4 assisted tackles. It just kind of all over the field, flying around, forced a fumble. DTY had a really solid game, coming up with an interception on a Gary Bohannon, just kind of a missed throw that looked like it was going to be going out of bounds, and then DTY just kind of slides in and takes it. I thought it was a good game. At the same time, when Baylor scores 27 on you and you lose, you're like, well, it was kind of an okay game. Through 3 quarters, they were playing great football. They were making enough plays, making enough stops to get Baylor off the field. Baylor missed some field goals, like Oklahoma missed some field goals. At the same time, like, they were long field goals, which if you're putting your kicker out there to kick a long field goal, that's pretty much a win for the defense, because those are going to go in not very consistently, unless you have a Gabe Burkich who had an off game. But, you look at the stats for Oklahoma, and I mean, Baylor didn't really have to do much through the air. Gary Bohannon only threw for 117 yards, or they had only 117 passing yards on the day. He was 12 of 21. He just averaged 5.6 yards per attempt. But that's the game plan for Baylor. Don't expect much out of Gary Bohannon. Run the football, dominate time of possession, control the ball, play good defense, and limit how much you have to expose Gary Bohannon in the passing game. Because in the first half, you saw it. Like, every time that they needed him to make a throw, he missed. There was a play down the field where I think it was Tyquan Thornton was running behind Key Lawrence, and he was open. And if Gary Bohannon hits that, that's a walk-in touchdown. But he overthrows the guy. And then on that 4th and 2 that was early in the game, he tries to throw the out route on the slat flat combo, and he throws it high and inside, right where the Oklahoma defender is, who's able to make the play and break it up. But if he throws that to the outside shoulder or to the pylon, that's a touchdown. Because the wide receiver has outside leverage. It should have been an easy pitch and catch. On that same play, he's got a receiver running the slant on that slant flat combo who is uncovered, completely uncovered. If he hesitates like a half a second and lets that develop a little bit, that's an easy just toss for a touchdown. And so you're thankful that you played a quarterback like Gary Bohannon, who's so inconsistent. At the same time, Baylor didn't need him to do much. But in the second half, the third quarter, the fourth quarter, that's when he really started to make some throws. He finally got comfortable enough to make some throws. There was the big touchdown to Tyquan Thornton that, and then he was really, really good in the running game as well. And so, well, I guess it wasn't a big touchdown. The big play to Tyquan Thornton that, set them up for a touchdown late in the game. I thought we were going to get Woody Washington back. It was evident that Key Lawrence was a little bit kind of unprepared, or he just was uncomfortable for what his responsibilities or what his technique was supposed to be in the passing game, because he just got beat on some simple things where he overcommitted to the run fake. Obviously Tyquan Thornton's a really good receiver, one of the better ones in the Big 12, and Key Lawrence just didn't really seem up to the task on this day. And that's not to say that he can't be a good corner. I just think that it was one of those situations where his inexperience kind of got the better of him. And I think he's still going to be good. And I think he still has an opportunity to be a good player for the Oklahoma Sooners, either at cornerback or at safety. He just needs to kind of trust the situation a little bit more and not overreact sometimes to what the wide receiver is doing. He has to understand maybe what the coverage is and not get be over aggressive on some of the double moves, because on the times where he did get beat behind him, he didn't have safety help. He's got to understand that and give a little bit more cushion and not let the guy get behind him. And so I still expect a good game, a good performance from Key Lawrence moving forward. They're not necessarily going to play a receiver as good as Tyquan Thornton the rest of the way. Iowa State's got a good one. The name is blanking on me right now. And they've got a good tight end in Charlie Kohler. But yeah, so I hope we get Woody Washington back. I think that helps moving forward, because you're not overexposing Key Lawrence as much. I felt like the defensive line, they had some moments where they were getting good penetration, but the over pursuit was killing them, because the Baylor running backs, whether it was Tristan Ebner or Abram Smith, they were able to cut backside and pick up big yardage on the cutback after Oklahoma was over pursuing. There were several times they were in the backfield and making first contact in the backfield, 2-3 yards behind the line of scrimmage, but the backside defenders were over pursuing, leaving just big holes for the Baylor running backs. And Gary Bohannon as well, like he was able to skirt out on the backside and pick up some big yardage. So I think that's something that that potentially is one of the downfalls of the speed D, is that over aggressiveness can really get you. It was a good game for the Oklahoma Sooners defense. It wasn't a great game. They held the team in it long enough for Oklahoma's offense to try and figure something out. Oklahoma's offense never could figure anything out. And by the time that, the Bears really started putting it on them in the fourth quarter, it was too much for the defense. They couldn't hold up, and that's no fault to theirs. I think they played their best game. Baylor had a 10 or 11 minute time of possession edge over the Sooners, and that's gonna play a factor in a game like this. And every possession counts, every snap counts, and the longer your defense is on the field, the harder it's going to be for them to get off the field late in the game. And Baylor took advantage of a tired Oklahoma defense in the fourth quarter, and I feel like that's really what separated things down the stretch. But coming up next, let's talk about where Oklahoma goes from here. What are their chances to make it to the Big 12 championship, college football playoff? They're slim, and the way things feel right now, the Big 12 championship game even feels like it's a long shot. But let's talk about that coming up next, after I talk to you about Built Bar. Built Bar is the best tasting protein bar ever. Easy to eat, 100% covered in chocolate, It tastes great and it's great for you. They got so many different flavors. My favorite's the peanut butter brownie, but they got mint brownie, coconut almond, salted caramel as well. If you love cherry barcia is fantastic. It's low calorie, low carb, low sugar, and it's high in protein. So all of the healthy benefits on top of just being purely delicious. It's the protein bar that tastes like a candy bar, and you can get it for 15% off over at built.com by using our promo code locked15. Again, that's 15% off using our promo code locked15 over at built.com. All right, so let's talk real quick about where Oklahoma goes from here. They got Iowa State next, and again, I think this is going to be a tough matchup. Iowa State, much like Baylor, coming into this week, Baylor was coming off a very disappointing loss to TCU, and came into this game against the Sooners and was just motivated, fired up, ready to play. They were physical. And I think Iowa State is going to bring some of the same challenges this next week after their loss to Texas Tech on that last second field goal. It's one of those, Oklahoma better be ready for Iowa State's best performance of the season, because Oklahoma's going to get it. And they got Breece Hall coming up. That's going to be a tough matchup. Brock Purdy, who's not a great quarterback, but he's kind of like a Gary Bohannon type where he can make some throws and he can beat you. But Iowa State's not going to put the ball in his hands and have him throw it 40, 50 times. So you want to get up on Iowa State and make the Brock Purdy, make him throw the ball a lot to try and beat you, because that's where your defense is at its best, is when you can pin your ears back as a pass rush and go after it. Can they make the Big 12 championship? I mean, obviously, if they win out, they'll be in. If they split these next two games, or if they lose to Iowa State, beat Oklahoma State, it's going to create some interesting situations in the tiebreaker. Really, they got to take care of business. The college football playoff appears to be a long shot at this point in time. 538.com gives them a 17% chance to make the college football playoff. Hey, so you're telling me there's a chance? It's slim, but there's a chance. A lot of things would have to go right for the Oklahoma Sooners to find themselves in the college football playoff. But that's way down the road. They've got a lot of football that they have to play, a lot of football they have to win in order to even put themselves in the conversation or in the discussion about it. And that starts with Iowa State this week. They've got to take care of business against Iowa State, who I think, again, I've said it several times, I think it's going to be a tough game. I think, they're going to get Oklahoma State's best, who is looking like easily the best team in the Big 12 right now. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know where this Oklahoma Sooners team, finishes the season. They've got these two tough matchups to end the regular season. And if they can get into the Big 12 championship, they'll have a tough game there as well, probably against Oklahoma State. If things play out the way Oklahoma hopes it will, it'll be a rematch of Bedlam in the Big 12 championship. But that's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Sooners. Again, thank you so much for tuning in. You can follow the show on Twitter at Locked On Sooners, on Facebook, Locked On Sooners Podcast. You can subscribe and like the show here on YouTube, so make sure you do that. You can download the podcast for free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And until tomorrow, where I'll go over some of my Big 12 power rankings heading into week 12. And we'll talk more about this performance against the Baylor Bears as well, because there's still a lot more to unpack. But we'll do it here tomorrow on the Locked On Sooners podcast. And until then, I'm John Williams. Boomer Sooner.